Those of you who haven't found a seat, if you feel free to sit in the aisle, or there's room down front here if you don't mind sitting on the floor, or you can stand. It's up to you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for turning out today on a beautiful fall day here in Princeton. I'm Brad Wilson. I'm Executive Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions here at Princeton University. We have a lecture series going on last year, this year, and then again next year, titled the Stewart Lecture Series on Institutional Corruption in America. We're very grateful to the Stewart Family Foundation and Robert Stewart, a Princeton alumnus, for their support for this series. Our first Stewart lecturer for this current academic year is Roger Scruton. We're very pleased to welcome Roger back. He's been a visiting fellow in the James Madison program. Former year, he taught a course that the program sponsored in the philosophy department on the philosophical foundations of conservatism, and we try to get him back whenever he's in the United States. The title of his talk is Fake Culture and the Culture of Fakes. Mr. Scruton is a writer and philosopher. He lives in rural Wiltshire, England. Currently a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, visiting professor of philosophy at St. Andrews and the University of Oxford. He's held teaching positions here and at Boston University, Birkbeck College in London. He's written widely on political and cultural issues, as well as on aesthetics, with particular attention to music and architecture. Among his many, many books are The Aesthetics of Architecture, with Princeton University Press, The Aesthetics of Music with Oxford University Press, and Green Philosophy, also with Oxford. His opera Violet was performed at the Guildhall, London, to widespread acclaim in 2004. He was founding editor of the Salisbury Review, as well as founder and director of Claridge Press, which is now part of Continuum International Publishing Group. Mr. Scruton earned his PhD, his MA, and his BA in philosophy from the University of Cambridge, and his law degree from Inner Temple in London. Please join me in welcoming Roger Scruton.
Thank you very much, Brad, and thank you to the Stewart Foundation for supporting this lecture series on institutional corruption. I was given a pretty difficult task, being asked to talk about corruption in the sphere of culture, because not only is it almost impossible to define that sphere, it is also the case that nobody seems to agree with anyone else as to what corruption then would consist in. So my talk today will be largely philosophical, trying to lay down some principles as to how we might judge culture from this point of view, from the point of view of its intrinsic corruption or degeneracy, and lay down some guidelines as to how we might think about what is emerging in cultural life today. Now, I shall speak informally in this. This is a very difficult room because I can't see you all at once. I have to keep revolving. But this is one of the natural triumphs of Frank Gehry, obviously, that to make even a lecture room impossible to use. Nevertheless, I will do my best to look up every now and then, and I'm going to use PowerPoint, which helps. It helps me because it takes your eyes away from me onto the screen. And obviously, the important point to start from is the definition of culture. Just what is culture? Many different uses of the term, obviously, that are familiar to you, and in particular, most people are familiar with the distinction between high culture, the kind of thing that gets talked about in universities, or used to get talked about in universities before they became corrupt, and popular culture, which is what you do, what you students do when you get back from the lecture hall and can put something in your iPod. So which, and there's a great question about the relation between these two. High culture consists of things like, obviously, art, music, literature, at the intellectual level, philosophy, and in general, all those things which you might regard as part of the self-consciousness of a civilization. You know, the attempt that a civilization makes to become conscious of its own meaning. I can't give a better definition than that. Obviously, if I were to try, that would be a whole course of lectures in itself. But let's assume that you understand that. You know, that part of what human beings do is this collective attempt to become conscious of what they are and to make that consciousness part of their own thinking and their daily lives. Popular culture, well, is it something completely different? Is it just entertainment, just something that amuses or distracts without having any intrinsic meaning to itself? Or is it something similar but just, as it were, has not yet been passed by the censors and received into the curriculum? I think everybody in America senses that there are real questions here. And for instance, music departments certainly are confronted with real questions here. Should a degree in musicology or a department of musicology offer courses on pop music? Or should we just leave that to the kids to do anyway? Do we need to teach it, etc.? Well, there's a tradition in the, perhaps tradition is the wrong word, but a kind of habit in the early 20th century among critics and philosophers who attended to this issue to distinguish high culture from popular culture, usually to the detriment of popular culture. The names that I've put up there are typical. Adorno, a Frankfurt School philosopher who ended up, who was a refugee from Nazism, ended up in California, as you know, and the recipient of all the usual generosity of his American hosts, which he repaid by pouring endless scorn upon their entertainment. And not only their entertainment, but everything that they thought and did, for which he was rewarded at every juncture, because Americans, up to the point where they finally discover what is being done to them, usually pay heavily to reward their critics. So he thought, and T.S. Eliot likewise, that high culture is a kind of realm of freedom. That's where human beings really come to realize their freedom, become what they fully are as choosing beings, and through that gain happiness and self-knowledge. Whereas popular culture looks like freedom, but in fact it's a realm of manipulation. In popular culture, you are the victim of the entertainment industry. They were thinking, Adorno was thinking of Hollywood and also the American songbook, you know, and jazz and so on. Most people now would say, well, that's nonsense. The American songbook has survived and become part of everything that we love. How could it be just dismissed in that way? But nevertheless, he had his reasons, and I might come back to them. But if you could think like that, the whole topic of culture would be a lot easier, wouldn't it? We'd only have to talk about high culture. But it's increasingly difficult to think like that. So I'll move on to the next question. What is corruption? We know what corruption is in the moral sphere, roughly, in politics and law and so on. It's something like putting self-interest before duty, as when a politician accepts bribes or whatever, or a judge doesn't declare an interest in the outcome of a case. So it's not so difficult to define there, but it's very difficult to extend that definition to the cultural sphere, because the cultural sphere is not obviously a sphere of duty. There aren't duties, or at least not widely and publicly recognized duties that lie upon the artist or the composer or the philosopher. It all depends upon what it is he or she is actually thinking about or attempting to do. So it's not so easy to define. But there is something that is worth pointing out, because it seems to be common to the political and the aesthetic sphere, and that is the idea of pretense. Moral corruption does breed pretense. I just indicate the examples there of totalitarian justice and kleptocracy and so on. In totalitarian systems, where people were, like the old communist systems in Europe or the Nazi system, in which people were punished for being nuisances, essentially, for having fallen foul of the political power, the powers that be, they would be put on trial, and the verdict would be predetermined, and the evidence would be fabricated and so on. But there is a pretense that this was an exercise of justice, and that pretense was regarded as extremely important. Important not just for manipulating opinion within the society as a whole, but also for claiming legitimacy vis-à-vis other powers, external to the realm. Well, and in kleptocracies, similarly, politicians hide what they're doing because they know that they can't do it if they reveal it. So there's a vast element of pretense, which we're seeing all around the Mediterranean today. But pretense is much more significant even in the realm of culture. People can pretend and spend a whole lifetime pretending, and that is the question I want to consider. To what extent is the culture that surrounds us now a pretense, or to what extent does it contain pretenses, and have we got any defence against that? Well, there are two kinds of pretense I want to consider: lying and faking. The word faking is perhaps not the best word for this, but I couldn't find another one. Lying is familiar to all of us, and because, of course, it's fundamental to the human condition, and it's one of the first things that we teach children not to do. And it's something that is within our power, both to do and not to do, because it's defined by an intention. If I say something to you intending to mislead you through implanting a false belief in your mind, that's a lie. And it doesn't require any cooperation from you to succeed in lying to you. And of course, politicians are always accused of lying for this very reason, that their accusers think that they are victims of the intentions that the politician has. But faking, as I would want to put it, is not defined in that way, but defined by an outcome. You're trying to create a false impression, and you're creating that false impression in the other by also convincing yourself. You're trying to connive with the other at creating the impression that you have some quality or some distinction which perhaps you don't have. So you can't achieve a fake merely by intending it. You've got to take yourself in. As we're all used to doing this, dramatizing ourselves in such a way that the other person believes us to be, say, suffering from some great tragic emotion, and reflects that belief back to us so we can believe it too. So there's a kind of reciprocal building up of a facade. And a lot of social life is like that. I mentioned the case of Felix Krull, who's the hero of an unfinished novel by Thomas Mann about this very matter. The matter of the subject matter of that novel is the confidence man, who is in the business of taking everybody in, but can only do it because he's half taken himself in and then relies upon their opinion to go whole hog and take himself in completely. So we can, in this way, we can fake our beliefs and our opinions. We can fake our expertise. All kinds of people exist in the world, whose reputation depends upon a reputation for being an expert in a certain field, even though they have faked it. But faking it means getting other people to believe it, and on the strength of their belief, believing it yourself. No need to give examples, because your lives will be full of them. You yourself are one. But now the real question when it comes to art is the question of fake emotion. Again, people often do refer to this, and we have a particular phenomenon in the aesthetic sphere, the phenomenon of kitsch, which is a most interesting phenomenon which has troubled me for much of my life. How would you define kitsch? It's as hard as defining all the other things, as hard as defining culture. But we immediately recognize it. We immediately recognize that something is falsifying the emotional life by making it sugary and tacky, and trying to elicit from us our complicity in doing that. And I'm going to come back to that in due course to try and say something more specific about it. But meanwhile, I think you should think about it. You all know what kitsch is, or at least you all have a view about what kitsch is. Some of you may mistakenly think that of a particular kind of kitsch that it is high art. You can make mistakes about it. But partly because this kind of faking is a matter of degree. Not only is it a matter of degree, but it also might be fundamental to the moral life to fake emotion in certain circumstances. Aristotle is a philosopher who is extremely important to read in this connection. Aristotle thought that we rational beings become fulfilled, in other words, we realize our nature only by acquiring virtue. But you can't acquire virtue just by deciding to be virtuous. A virtue is a disposition, a habit, something instilled in the soul. So it's a great question, how do you ever acquire it? And Aristotle said, well, you have to begin somewhere, and the best way is to begin through imitation. You imitate the person who has the virtue of courage or justice, whatever, and you go on doing it until suddenly you find that you spontaneously do the courageous thing and want to do it. It is a bit like the Alcoholics Anonymous slogan, fake it till you make it. That's Aristotle's view of the moral life generally. And it might actually be right. But it means that there's a serious difficulty we have at distinguishing real emotion from fake emotion if we have to get to the real emotion through the discipline of faking. Well, anyway, again, going back to the distinction between faking and lying, you lie by intending to deceive, but you fake by not intending to deceive. I'm not intending to deceive you about my emotional life, and thereby deceiving both the other and yourself. So in some sense, faking is something you can't intend to do. It's a social activity, or rather you can't succeed in doing merely by intending it. It's a social activity which also creates a social context and a web of expectations and rewards. And in the cultural sphere, I think there's a tremendous motive towards faking of this kind, both in the artistic sphere and in the intellectual sphere, and in all spheres where people judge each other one way or another on the strength of the genuineness of what they are. So the possibilities of faking in the cultural sphere are legion. I want to say that faking is the primary form of cultural corruption. I may be wrong about this, but as I said at the outset, trying to define what cultural corruption is so difficult that one's got to start from some concrete sense of how it might go in a particular tradition. And I think we have emerged into a condition in which faking is part of the way in which everything in the cultural sphere goes wrong. And now Adorno's dismissal of Hollywood, which I referred to earlier, goes in that, is exactly this kind of criticism. He dismissed Hollywood and the American songbook and jazz and so on, saying that the whole thing is essentially a fake. That's to say that it's pretending to a meaning, an emotional depth and sincerity, to an impact on the human condition, which it doesn't in fact achieve. because it is simply pretending to that. But it's also trying to take its audience in so that the audience believes that it is what it pretends to be. So, and of course, then this feeds back into the Hollywood filmmaker's mind, so that the Hollywood filmmaker thinks he is doing the real thing. So that by a complicit arrangement with his audience, he achieves the goal of faking it completely, but nevertheless not being real. Now, the sense that this is possible is ancient, and I think underlying many of the criticisms that literary critics make, and also social and cultural critics of cultural degeneracy, is the ancient condemnation of idolatry. So let's sort of say a little bit about idolatry before going on. Idolatry is, in my sense of the word, faking but not lying. I'm thinking of the condemnations of idolatry that you find in the Torah and the Quran. Okay, that, in other words, worshipping the graven image. We endow the idol with a significance that it doesn't have. That's obviously, for the monotheists, that's the premise of what's wrong with idolatry. But we then take ourselves in, and say, through the ritual, the act of worship, the beating of drums, and usually maybe a human sacrifice or two, that the whole thing becomes so tense with meaning that we are persuaded in ourselves that this thing must have that power that we have attributed to it. There's something in human nature which I think we can recognize here. If we can work ourselves up into the condition of being frightened by something, that thing becomes frightening, and then it becomes powerful. So we are enslaved by our own creation. And the Torah identifies this as the primary way in which a soul is corrupted, and so too does the Quran. This is how the soul becomes corrupted, through this form of idolatry. And I think this idea survives in the 19th century philosophers who criticized fetishism, and indeed criticized religion as a form of fetishism generally. This is the idea that was put forward vigorously by Feuerbach in his book, The Essence of Christianity, and taken up by Karl Marx in his theory of what he calls the fetishism of commodities. In other words, our disposition to become enslaved to the world of exchange and money and instrumental value. That we become enslaved to it because actually we are attributing from our own emotions the power that money and commodities and consumable things have, and then becoming, as it were, victims of those things. So there survives in Marx's theory of criticism of the capitalist economy this sense that human beings are susceptible to idolatry, and in falling victim to it, they are also, in some sense, corrupting their own souls. So the idol is a false god. So the contrast here is between a world of fakes, which idols represent, and a world of truth. And that, of course, is a fundamental thought in the Bible. There is a world of truth which this is obscuring. We must take this veil of idolatry away so that we know what is the real truth of our condition. And that survives in the writings of modern critics. Well, this brings me back to one or two examples. Well, an example anyway. Fake philosophy. Philosophy is part of high culture. At least it is when properly done. And I think here it's comparatively easy to recognize the fake because we have an intuitive sense of the constraints, truth, validity, relevance, and so on, which must be obeyed. We know how philosophy ought to go. We don't know what is perhaps the best form of it, or which arguments are really valid, but we can know when somebody is ignoring entirely those internal constraints that make philosophy what it is. I give you a quote there from Jacques Lacan. It is the connection between signifier and signifier that permits the elision in which the signifier installs the lack of being in the object relation using the value of reference back, possessed by signification in order to invest it with the desire aimed at the very lack it supports. That's only one sentence chosen at random from a whole page of similar noises. Now, I think Jacques Lacan's had a huge influence in philosophy and literature, especially in this country, and through his acolytes like Derrida and so on, and Deleuze. But I think you can recognize that there is something fake about that. There is no way in which you can pin down the meaning of the pronouns, for a start. There's no way in which you can attribute a clear syntax to the whole. But it isn't deceiving us so much as inviting us into a realm where we deceive each other into thinking that we are thinking when we're not. That is what it's a fundamental characteristic of faking. And I think that there's been a huge invasion of the university, especially of humanities departments, by that kind of complicit deception. You may not agree, but obviously it's always contentious and provocative to take any particular writer and say this, but you've got to start somewhere, and I may be wrong, but it looks to me as though this is fake, and there's a growth of a whole kind of literature about literature, which is designed to fortify this kind of nonsense and make it look as though it is the foundation of a wholly new way of doing philosophy, a wholly new way of thinking. And in a way, it is a wholly new way of thinking for a university to surrender completely to nonsense. But it's not the kind of novelty which one should be proud of. Well, there was a particular book written about this by Jean Bricmont and Alan Sokal called Intellectual Impostures in the English edition. I think it's called Fashionable Nonsense in French, in which they took lots and lots of these examples from the French bureaucracy of the 60s and so on, which were being treated as authorities in humanities departments in American universities, and tried to show that there was nothing there. Derrida did respond to this in one interview with a passing remark. He referred to Alan Sokal as le pauvre Sokal, meaning that he'd missed something. And he was right, because Sokal, both in this book and in his famous article in Social Text, in which he satirized the whole thing, he didn't see what was behind this, the binding principle behind the nonsense. But fake thought is an invitation to membership. It's saying, look, join with me in this, and there is power in it. You don't have to go through all that business of learning how to prove the appendices of Principia Mathematica or anything like that. You can be a thinker, just as I'm a thinker, if you can do it this way. And that membership is very important, I think, as it binds people within the realm of nonsense and fortifies their nothingness with that wall of nonsense. And you will discover, I think, if you look at this literature more closely, that this call to membership is always very close to the surface. Right, well, that's all I'm going to say about fake philosophy. Obviously controversial, may not be right. But much more interesting and much more difficult is the subject of fake art. Faking in art is far more difficult to analyse because the constraints are not clear. Art is not trying to say something true or to produce a valid argument. It's trying to capture our interest in a certain way, but it's a very special kind of interest, and nobody, to my knowledge, has really been able to define what the interest is to which art is addressed, or at least to define it in a way which commands widespread consent. And this is indeed why aesthetics is such a difficult topic and has largely disappeared from the philosophical curriculum for that reason. Well, because it's so difficult to say what the interest is that art addresses, we have witnessed the birth of conceptual art, art that affirms that it is art by denying it. Starting off, of course, with Duchamp's famous urinal that was ordinary porcelain urinal signed with a fictitious name and put in an exhibition, and caused a stir. This was a long time ago. I think it was something like 100 years ago, nearly 90 years ago. No, 100 years ago. And has gone on creating a stir ever since. And Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes, likewise. John Cage's famous piece of music, so-called, in which a fully dressed concert pianist enters, sits at a piano, and is silent for 4 minutes 33 seconds, and then leaves the stage. Now, that's one obvious reaction to this is to say that this is just a joke, and in the case of Duchamp, it was. But people went on repeating the joke, and since jokes, when repeated, cease to be jokes, it must be something else. It must be something serious. So what is it? Well, it's something that is drawing attention to its own status without really having that status. So it's putting in question the concept of art. And I think thinking about that, you can go slightly over the top in response to these examples. Arthur Danto indeed took them extremely seriously in his many books on aesthetics, arguing that indeed these cases show that art has in some sense come to an end. Hegel had already said that it was going to come to an end in the early 19th century. Hegel thought it would be replaced by philosophy, because philosophy would give the abstract meaning of things. It would take us into the next stage of man's self-understanding, and art would no longer be either necessary or possible. And Hegel's theory is extremely interesting, but Danto revives that theory and says that here we have examples where art has become conscious of itself in a way which also kills itself. It as it were, puts its own concept on display, and we see that concept contains no ability to define itself, or is in conflict with itself. Now, it's a big question why we should go that far. After all, people went on painting in the old way, composing in the old way, despite Duchamp and Cage, and the old art forms remain. So isn't this just a byway in modern artistic life? Not something that we should take as seriously as the critics took it. And maybe that's right. Maybe Duchamp did intend everything as a joke. Warhol, it's not clear. Cage, I think, probably did intend it slightly as a joke, but it was a very lucrative joke, and so the motive to carry on repeating it is very strong. So, does this mean that conceptual art is a kind of fake? Now, there is certainly an element of taking in here, complicity between artist and audience in the claim to status. John Cage wouldn't have got anywhere if he hadn't immediately inspired a whole army of critics and musicologists taking 4 minutes 33 seconds as the most important work that has been composed in the last decade. This is where we've got to. This is really important. And of course, when you have a work of art that manifestly says nothing, there is no limit to the number of words that you can add by way of explaining it. Because it doesn't actually form any constraint on your discourse. Many people would say, well, look, isn't this a case of the emperor's clothes all over again? Aren't we just waiting for the new critic who says, the emperor is actually, emperor's new clothes are in fact non-existent? Well, the question is not as simple as that, because the artist and the audience collaborate in these adventures in attributing a certain status to these works of conceptual art, and it's that status which is so difficult to define. What is the status? that these works are trying to claim for themselves and succeeding in claiming for themselves because they've persuaded the critics to do it for them. That is the central question of aesthetics. Right, well, to understand it, I think we have to go back a little bit to the cult of genius as it arose during the Enlightenment. In the Enlightenment, art suddenly came to the fore, at least in our civilization, as the repository of the human soul. It's to art that we must look if we want to know what is deep in us, that which bears the meaning of human life. And art rescues the soul from science in a way that religion used to do, perhaps, but religion is dwindling. Art alone stands firm. And that's why you get this enormous emphasis on art, the birth of the subject of aesthetics, and the self-conscious presentation of art as a way of life and a form of, as an expression of genius. It's the thing which gives objective form to that subjective thing within us where meaning resides. To do that, it has to be original. Genius is always original. It's always that individual human being who's putting his soul into the work and presenting it to us in a way which gives us insight into the human tradition. So this cult of genius went with an emphasis on the distinction between art and craft. In art, we're doing something which has to be understood as the unique individual gesture in which something intrinsic to that human being is brought into realization. In craft, we're just carrying out a skill which we can learn and pass on, but which can be engaged in without that element of genius which lifts it from the realm of mere competence into the realm of ideas. So skill is never sufficient to produce art. And in art, the rules can always be broken, and indeed the great effects come when the rules are broken, as by, say, Michelangelo in his later Pietas and so on. Now that is, we can all accept that. Those are commonplaces which, since the Enlightenment, have been accepted by most people who thought about the nature of art. But there's a conclusion that is drawn from them, which is by no means a commonplace and which seems to me to be false. The conclusion that because skill is not sufficient to produce art, it's not necessary either. And the conclusion that because rules can be broken by the genius, that genius shows itself by the breaking of rules. So all you need to do to produce art is first of all to ensure that you've got no skills, and secondly, try and find a rule and break it. And as out of this comes a new kind of art which is essentially transgressive. Instead of trying to be in any way to relate to the great traditions of painting, literature and music that we've inherited, it is just looking for some new way to transgress things. It was once called the tradition of the new, but it's really the cliche of the unexpected. So there's a huge motive to fake it, and let me give you some examples. Here is a particularly horrible thing by the Chapman brothers, English artists, whose work, at least at this period, entirely consisted in taking some caricature of the human form and making it repulsive in some new way. Noses in the form of penises, as in this thing, and people joined in the most horrible and distorted manner. Doesn't mean anything, but of course it is original. And that was enough. So it's ended up in the museum. Tracy Emin's bed is an extremely important example. I'll say a little bit more about this. Tracy Emin, on the strength of this, has been appointed Professor of Drawing at the Royal Academy. She can't actually draw, and she never has drawn, but this bed caused a great stir, and it is now on display in Tate Modern. It's her bed as she left it one morning with all the apparatus of a slightly degenerate life lying around it. I want to contrast it with a bed by Delacroix. Delacroix did the same with his bed, but he made it into a painting. And it's actually a very beautiful painting in the Maison de la Croix in Paris. What is the difference between those two? Yes, I want to talk about Plato is famous for considering the form of the bed. So these two examples give us an insight into Plato, what Plato is getting at. In the Delacroix painting, just to go back to it just for a second, you see that skill is very visible. Also, rule following follows not only laws of perspective, but it has a specific point of entry and just a pillow point, and balance between the forms and so on. The element of transgression is played down, it's absorbed into a play of light. And although there is an indication here that maybe two people were in that bed, you can see the way in which the pillows can take the form of two faces kissing. It's not explicitly said. I should say that Tracy Emin's bed has several used contraceptives lying by its side. So transgression is played down, it's absorbed into the play of light. The painting is saying something about the bed and the wrestling that it witnessed, the wrestling of the artist in his nighttime labours. So the soul is, so to speak, there in the sheets. And I would say that Tracy Emin's bed is a piece of life debris. We can deduce things from it about what that life is, but it doesn't express those things. It doesn't give them articulation in a way which, as it were, moves us to think, yes, that's exactly a form of life which I can understand. It has significance, but it's also, at some level, a fake. Well, you might not accept that, and I've got very little time, so I'm going to have to rush through what I have to say. All this arose because of the modernists said to us that the old forms of art were exhausted, they'd become cliches. And if we used them, the result would be fake art. Art should be a discipline which we aim at, and which aims at the truth to life, or truth to the soul. That's the kind of message you get from Eliot and Matisse, Stravinsky and so on, that you must at all costs avoid cliché, because cliché is a kind of falsehood in itself. That's where faking comes in. And this was emphasized by Clement Greenberg in a famous essay in Partisan Review, Avant-Garde or Kitsch, which said explicitly that there's only one choice for the modern artist, either to join the avant-garde or to remain attached to forms of painting which would only produce kitsch. There can only be kitsch if you went on painting realist painting or figurative painting now. So he dismissed, for instance, Edward Hopper, who was probably the greatest painter of that day, as empty, repetitious and kitschy. So there arose this thing called kitschophobia. And the idea is that the cliches are always threatening the artist, because everything has been done before, perhaps, and at least if you're imitating some great predecessor, the danger is that you'll do something that's been done before, and the result will be a fake. We know what fake emotion is, because we're all sentimental at times. We all want the benefit of feeling without the cost. That means that we all are apt to wallow in emotion in which it's the self that matters and not the object. And that is a well-known human vice, and that is what cliché encourages in the artist too. A cliché it's ready-made, it's claiming an effect without the trouble of working for it. And for deep reasons, we abhor cliché in art. This cliché is attacking that very essence of art, the thing that art is supposed to be doing, to acquire that status that I referred to earlier. And cliché is connected with kitsch. So people begin to develop styles in which the avoidance of cliché is all important. But of course, if you go on avoiding cliché all the time, that becomes a routine. So that it becomes a cliché in its turn, the Brillo box cliché, into which Andy Warhol fell. One after another, the Brillo boxes came off the production line. And why was that not a cliché? This means, as a result of this, a new kind of fake art arose, which I call preemptive kitsch. This is Jeff Koons in visual arts, or Philip Glass in music. You know, somebody said that the tonic triad is a cliche. You can't use it anymore. So Philip Glass wrote whole operas which consist of arpeggiated tonic triads with an occasional dominant, if you're lucky, going on for an hour at a time. Because then people would, you know, he couldn't possibly be seriously meaning it, so he was drawing attention to the fact that he wasn't meaning it. He's drawing attention to the fact that it's kitsch, so it can't be kitsch. You know, it's kitsch laughing at itself. So I'll give you some examples. This is real kitsch, obviously. It's Elvis and Jesus, in case you hadn't... I know from the younger people here probably wouldn't know who either of those are. But this takes me back to idolatry. Here is Michael Jackson, kitschified into the most repulsive thing imaginable. You know, why does this make the clothes curl? That's it. But then Alan Jones takes Michael Jackson and his pet monkey and goes so over the top that you can't think that he really didn't know what he was doing. This is not kitsch. It's somebody saying this is kitsch, you know, in inverted commas. I'm drawing attention to the fact that the cult of Michael Jackson is also something which should be put in inverted commas and held at a distance. And even more so, of course, is Jeff Koons. Here is preemptive kitsch at its most developed. It's a fake. You know, if he did this, if he just loved children's balloons and made his own little child's balloon out of aluminium and sprayed it and then put it in his garden, we'd all think, yeah, this guy obviously hasn't got very much taste. But to do it publicly like that and desecrate a great classical building with it shows that you really know that it's repulsive, and you're putting it on display in order to show that there is something about the culture of fakes which you want to comment upon. So this is a fake in inverted commas, a fake conscious of itself. So just very briefly, where have we got to? I got this far and I realised that I didn't know where I'd got to, because looking back on it, I don't know which is the real fake and which is the fake and which is not a fake at all in all that I've been talking about. But I do know, of course, that there are examples of genuine art, and we want to hang on to that idea, the idea that there is true feeling, and genuine art is concerned with true feeling. It's concerned with bringing out what is best in human beings, what is most deeply felt, what is most appropriate as an object of sympathy, and presenting it in objective form so that other people will be able to enter into it and make it part of their lives. And we have such hundreds of paradigms of this, from Homer to Van Gogh, which are just incontrovertible. There is real human life, real human feeling, which isn't faking anything, not trying to deceive either you or itself. And I think that the status that we accord to art is justified by the fact that there are those things, and that when we try to make works of art for ourselves, that's really what we should be doing, to try and belong to that tradition of putting what is deepest in ourselves into objective form. But if we have nothing deep in ourselves, no true feeling to express, our work of art will be a fake, and will depend upon an activity of faking comparable to the fake philosophy that I discussed earlier. And I suspect that a lot of conceptual art is largely faked in that respect. But I'll leave you with the question, why does it matter? Thank you.
We have a good amount of time for some questions from the audience. So in conformity with Madison program habit, if not tradition, I want to invite any students in the audience to ask the first questions. Yes, sir.
Let's see. Would you say there's a difference between faking and working in a different mode in searching? Like, I mean, I think it's pretty reductive to say that 433 is like the epitome of Cage's output, especially because he started with music that was pretty traditional in terms of pretty traditional.
Can you just repeat? Go back to the beginning.
So I'm asking if there's a difference between faking and working in a different mode, I guess you'd say. And I think Cage gets a lot of crap for this because people consider 433 like his magnum opus, which in some ways is true, but in others isn't. One, because I think 433 is like an outgrowth of Cage's artistic career. I think he started with really not traditional music, but it was pretty straightforward in terms of composition, pretty traditional. But I think external circumstances, like economic circumstances, the fact that he didn't have access to a lot of instruments, and that sort of thing dictated, I guess, the materials he worked with, so like radios or found objects. And in doing and also incorporating chance procedures. So what happens is he gets less, I guess, orthodox sound and gets a lot of silence. And so I think he expands on those discoveries into something different, as opposed to people who decide that they're going to do something like, oh, totally edgy, and like they do something like that without having the historical exploration that's led up to that point. So I'm wondering if you'd say that Cage is fake because he arrived at something that's not necessarily palatable. I mean, how would you deal with the fact that what he did seemed to be like the result of a real exploration instead of something reactionary?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I wasn't certain about the Cage example, but of course you're absolutely right. People make a great fuss of that example because you can say so much about it, but if you're right, it is actually simply the extreme point, the asymptotic point of a career, a development, as he experiments with incorporating silence into other pieces of music. And of course, all his stuff for prepared pianos and so on is completely different from this, but this is, as it were, like a byproduct of that. And it is actually true that many really original works of art, once put into the context from which they came, do change radically in our perception. If you think of abstract art, the abstract art of Matisse, for instance, you go back to where he began as a figurative painter, and then his sort of post-impressionist way of treating his figures, and gradually letting the geometry and the colours come to the surface and the figures retreat until eventually it was pure geometry and colour. Then indeed you see that this is actually exploring something which has as it were, an inherited meaning. And that would be a way of rescuing it, so to speak. And I don't know what to say, except that on the question of Cage, there is some evidence that he did have musical ability, but there are plenty of followers who use this as an excuse for producing music without any musical ability. That's where we have the question whether it's a fake or not.
Other student questions?
Gentleman at the back.
I'm curious to know what your response to that question is. Why does it matter? The last question you asked.
Oh, right. I suppose it matters to me because I spent my whole life thinking about art and music and literature and trying to make it part of my life. And if there's no difference between the real thing and the fake, maybe I have the question: am I a fake or the real thing? There is a real sense that there's so much invested into it, but then I look at myself and I think I only invested this because I felt that there really was something to invest, and that the works of art which I love because they contain something which is important for me, and the possession of which has made my life worthwhile in a way that it wouldn't otherwise have been. But how to put it into words is, of course, the great problem.
Kind of a follow-up question. Why do you think it should matter
To you, yes. Well, I suppose this is the teacher's universal problem. Why should he think that what matters to him matters so much to these young people that he spends a lot of time trying to put it across to them? Especially if he's not paid for it. You know, that's the real question, and that's been with us since Plato and before, that question. All I would say in response to it is that my life has been so enriched by all this that I wouldn't like you to go through life without having the chance of being enriched likewise. But it wouldn't be a sin in you not to be.
Other student questions? I was just wondering what you would say about, I was thinking about this in relation to musical performance, and I was struck by a term on your last slide, genuine expression, and I'm relating this to, I'm thinking about that in terms with your term of cliche, and thinking of this, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Naomi Cummings' book, The Sonnet Self, and where she draws on Pierce's semiotic work, and she says, well, there's no such thing as intuition. There's no such thing as, because we're just a product of our past experiences, there's no such thing as spontaneity. There's no such thing as the inner musical self, because this so-called thing which we call it the inner self or presence in a musical performance is really just our set of tools which we use, our set of cultural tools, we might even call those cliches, which we use to express ourselves, if we can actually use that word. So, in this sense, if these things don't exist, then isn't it possible just to say that so-called genuine expression is just a lot of cliches?
Gosh, that's very elaborate question, really. I suppose what I would say is this, that Naomi Cummings is not right about thinking that a work of music is simply a tool for us to be putting our own emotion into it. There is, if you take a great, she wrote a very important article once on Bach's Barmerdich from the St. Matthew Passion, which is one of the most emotionally rich pieces of music ever written. I think one would say of that piece that it contains emotion objectively within itself. And it's an emotion which many people now have not experienced except through that piece of music. We're not familiar with the kind of total contrition, total sense of our own unworthiness and the helplessness that brings with it, that Bach is expressing in that moment in the Passion. But we do know it because we know we respond to that incredible melody on the violin. And I think she was aware of that. One doesn't want to talk in terms of self or anything like that, but just that here is a piece of music which actually contains a feeling which we need to know and we modern people find very difficult to know, but here it is, a gift. And the right performance is the performance that makes that gift once again available. It's not just that we're using this as a tool to play with our own emotions. We're hearing something that comes from outside. That's what I would say. Not sure that answers your question, but it's at least relevant.
My question is much less intelligent than the ones we've been hearing so far, but I was just wondering, throughout the presentation it seemed to me like basically taking sides between what you would consider high art and popular art, pop culture. And I was wondering if you thought, I was trying to glean from your definition of pop culture, maybe what you did, but I couldn't quite catch it, maybe I missed it. If you thought that maybe a piece of art, a piece of music, a philosophical theory might be popular because it might be good, or if it might be popular because it's not kitschy, or is the fact that it's popular, does that make it kitschy? Is that in its nature itself?
Yes. I think you're right to raise this question. I raised it myself at the beginning in connection with people like Adorno and T.S. Eliot and so on, who had wanted to put all popular culture to one side as somehow something quite different. It's just entertainment, not an exploration of the human spirit or whatever. And it's very hard, though, to go through with that. And one of the reasons is the one that you said, that many things are popular because they're good. That certainly in the realm of architecture, if you ask yourself, why is Venice so popular? It's because it is just a beautiful city, and everybody recognizes this. And there isn't any dispute about it. And in certain realms of music, why is Mozart so popular? Because he's the best. But there is I suppose what those critics were thinking about was the growing divergence between the high culture and the popular culture, which began, I guess, in the late 19th century as forms of entertainment, forms of music, and so on arose, which didn't have the kind of high seriousness of the works of the concert hall tradition or the major theatres or the serious intellectual novels. So the question is, are they the same thing or doing something else? I didn't want to come down with any definite view about this, although I suspect that Robbie George would say, since he's in the Madison program, or indeed he's your chief, he would say that bluegrass music owes its popularity to its virtues. But I think he would also say that these virtues, of course, are not to be compared with the virtues of Bach or Beethoven, but they still are virtues. I think that would be probably the simplest thing to say.
Melissa Machado, there are now some open seats for anyone who wants to relocate.
I had a question.
Yes.
I had a question about your distinction between, in a sense, true and false art in the last part as being based on true feeling. That was the sort of hallmark of what true art was expressing. And I was wondering there what the sort of preconditions for true feeling are, in the sense that when there's a real sense in which feelings can be neither true nor false, they just are. But there also is a sense in which they can be true and false insofar as they do or do not adequately respond to real objective value. So is that what you had in mind? And if so, then I wonder what the sort of philosophical preconditions are for that. And if the absence, perhaps, of those conditions are the reasons why we're getting the kind of complete subjectivism that you think is a problem in the art world.
Well, that's a very intelligent question, and essentially it answers itself, luckily, because you effectively said that what makes emotion real is that it responds to the situation in the real world and evaluates that situation, and is, as it were, not just a kind of game that the subject is playing with himself. It's a responding and evaluating, and I think that is all important. And I think literary critics are very aware of this when criticising a poem. They make a distinction between the poem that just puts a veil over the reality and turns your eyes onto the poet's sensitive soul, and the poem that actually gives you the concrete object and makes you feel it. And I think that's the sort of thing that I had in mind. But again, it goes back to that worry I had about Aristotle on imitation, that we all live to some extent by faking it. What would happen to good manners if only sincerity were allowed? If every time someone said, "Have a good day," I said, "You don't need that." In America in particular, everything would collapse. So there has to be that element of faking in the heart of our ordinary social relations. But we all of us think that there's a moment, and that moment is what defines intimacy, and it stops. And then what we need then is a philosophy of intimacy.
I wanted to ask about your concept of pretense, because I wanted to suggest that maybe pretense is central to operatic culture, particularly maybe the operas of Handel in London in the early 18th century and Italian opera in the 19th century. And maybe more fundamentally that some sort of pretense is central to music listening, in that we, listening to a piece of music, might suspend our interest in the world that immediately surrounds us and enter into the world that the music offers us. So, for example, when we listen to a Beethoven piano sonata and we might find it expressive of a particular emotion, it's not necessarily the case that the pianist who's playing it feels that emotion. They express it. So maybe you could say that there's pretense at stake here. And I wondered also if this maybe relates to an idea in German philosophy, maybe going back to Kant, about works of art creating a world in which we enter, suspending our interest in the kind of real world that surrounds us. This seems to me a little bit like the idea of pretense, but it's not necessarily pejorative, at least for my listening it isn't.
Right, gosh, that's a very difficult question. There seems to be a whole row of musicians there. I guess you have to safety in numbers. I think that when you enter the theatre, and in particular the operatic theatre, as you were saying, you're aware that there are conventions that are controlling all this. So that in a Handel aria, just to take your example, the heroine comes forward on the stage and says, "Che traditore," and she just goes on about being betrayed, and then you get to the middle section where she says something else, then she comes back and says it all over again because of the structure of the aria. You might say, "Okay, we've heard that. What are you going to do about it?" But that isn't relevant. We know that's not relevant because here is an artistic convention within which, nevertheless, Handel is presenting very real emotions. And the music is giving them form, so to speak. There's no reason why they shouldn't be repeated, given that you're marking time dramatically, but enjoying the presentation of the feeling. And you go on. So I think that it would be wrong to say that is pretense or any kind of fake. On the contrary, this is realism. Many people say, look, because of the conventions, Handel was able to present real, raw emotions for the first time. Well, perhaps not for the first time, but for the first time with such effect on the stage. So I think, in the end, we want to say that what looks like pretense may turn out to be simply the necessary conventions for something to be real.
So it strikes me that a lot of what you said in the second part of the piece could have been summed up very nicely at the beginning when you talked about the difference between duty versus self-interest. And it strikes me that a lot of what you're talking about, the fake, are people that are out there actively seeking the self-interest and seeking membership, as you talked about it, and the power that comes from membership. And so my question to you is the motive behind this and behind these people. I could imagine some people who are lack talent or lack any sort of malevolent wishes on anybody, and they just kind of want to be a part of an in crowd. And I could also imagine and kind of the nihilistic destruction of the true and the crowding out and burying of that which is true is just kind of an unfortunate byproduct of their ambition. But I could also imagine a group of people who are actively hostile to what is true and what is beautiful, and this is a means to an end for them, and the fake is actually just a tool as opposed to what they end up doing. And so I wonder if you could comment on the motives of the fakers.
Well, gosh, yes. I was trying to avoid that, but their motives are of two kinds, or at least two kinds. There are two, in this area, it's very important to distinguish the deliberate intention. So I know there's a lot of money involved in getting my works of art into Tate Modern, and I'm going to do whatever it is required to get that money. Okay, there's a deliberate intention. But then there are motives which are not like that, in which you know that there is a reward, but the reward comes only to those people who are not aiming at it. But nevertheless, you aim at it, but while telling yourself that you're not aiming at it. Consider friendship. You know that there's a reward of friendship that comes from friendship, that you get help in the time of trouble and company in times of success and so on. There's huge rewards, huge benefits. But if you aim at them, you don't get them. Because aiming at them means you're not a friend. You're not treating the other as valuable for his own sake, but only for what he brings. So to get those rewards, you have to keep them out of mind. But they come to the surface. And so there's all kinds of states of mind between pure friendship, pure sacrificial friendship, where the other is the thing, the object of love, and the purely interested manipulation of the other. There's a whole area in between where it's not clear. And this is where the confidence man gets to work. And I think in all this area I've been talking about in art, we're in one of those intermediate areas where the artist is partly in the business of conning himself, as well as but doing so by bringing out the same desire in the audience. So that's the sort of motive. There are motives, as you say, that there's this desire, as D.H. Lawrence put it, to do dirt on life. And that thing of the Chapman brothers is clearly that. And all their art is like that. It comes from some kind of deep alienation from the human condition and the desire to point out to us all that it isn't worthwhile. Which it isn't if you're like them, but they haven't done the right thing, which is obviously to kill themselves. Right.
You've spoken mainly about the fake in painting and music. You mentioned very briefly architecture. You mentioned the wonderful architecture of Venice and how it's not only genuine, but it's genuine in a way that can appeal to a broad audience, not simply an elite audience. I'm wondering if you would extend your understanding of the fake to architecture. In general, when I look around this campus and I see the beautiful Gothic cathedral, and I see the Winclio buildings and in Greek architecture, and even the Nassau Hall and very early colonial, I think of genuine architecture. When I look at this building by Frank Gehry, I have a very different view, and I'm wondering, would you extend your understanding of the fake to architecture, and how would you describe a fake architecture? Give us an example.
That's a very interesting question, because of course the modernists, looking at the old modernists like Pevsner and all his crew, who were brought up on the Bauhaus, when going around Princeton would say it's all fake. It's simply stage effects, and this isn't real Gothic architecture, isn't a real Gothic chapel, and so on. And that argument prevailed in the early 20th century, and actually led to people giving up the classical tradition and giving up the Gothic. To my view, that was a disaster, because it meant they were giving up the only styles that they had which could confidently elicit the support and favour of the ordinary person. The question of whether this kind of architecture is fake, obviously it's very sensitive to talk about it in the building. But there is something which happened to architects at a certain stage, which is that they started believing that architecture is an art just like any other, which is essentially a form of personal expression, putting yourself on display, making it clear that you're performing the original gesture that will draw attention to that genius within you, the genius soul. So taking that Enlightenment idea of genius and applying it in an area where actually I think it shouldn't be applied, because architecture isn't about expressing the individual soul, it's about conforming to the requirements of public life. Most of the users of a building don't ever go inside it, they just walk outside it. And so I think that did distort the practice of architecture. And of course, we know that Frank Gehry, whatever his virtues, modesty isn't one of them. And obviously drawing attention to himself is a very important part of his enterprise. And some people would say, yeah, that means that he's not doing real architecture. It's more like so he were a failed sculptor, but with a vast canvas to work on.
The students here, when they've been told about what buildings they like the best, usually comes the Gothic. The Gothic is the one that the students say they like the best.
Yes. Yes. It's dangerous to rely on student polls because.
Speaking of architecture,
Right.
appreciated by 20-year-olds.
Yes. No, I agree. Yeah, well, yeah.
Maria Rilke wrote, "Works of art are of infinite loneliness, and with nothing to be so little reached as with reason, only love can grasp and hold and fairly judge them." Could we have your perspective on art and true art, kitsch and cliché in regard to that?
Can you give me the quotation again?
Works of art are of infinite loneliness, and with nothing to be so little reached as with reason, only love can grasp and hold and fairly judge them.
Well, I think I agree with that. I usually agree with what Rilke says. The loneliness, I mean, there's two kinds of loneliness. There's loneliness that is a reaching out to others, and there's loneliness which is a retreat from them. And Rilke was very good at reaching out to others through his loneliness, because it's something that can be shared. And one of the consolations of poetry is just that you find your inner loneliness mirrored in something else. And that's possible if it's a genuine feeling and it's genuinely and deeply felt. So it rather confirms what I was saying about what true art is. It must come from that depth of sentiment which can't be faked.
Well, Frank Lloyd Wright, perhaps apocryphally, was credited with saying the only genuine building on this campus, and presumably said this in the 1930s, was Alexander Hall. He didn't like the other ones. I could also observe that maybe opera is the rap music of the 18th century. It took me years to come to a conclusion, I think similar to yours, if not exactly the same, and that was that high cultural circles told me I was supposed to like all this stuff. And if I didn't know I wasn't the real person, certainly not a high culture person. So, but it grated on me, and it took years to. Finally, I decided this stuff was either synthetic at the superficial level, it was just stuff tacked together to be different. There are so many different ways you could do that. Or it was really an effort to blaspheme the Holy Spirit, to put it very bluntly, or to blaspheme some beautiful spirit that was behind art, with poetry, music, whatever. That's sort of the conclusion I got. So in that sense, do you think if you had some very evil spirit about you and produced art as a basis of that, is that genuine or not?
Well, this is connects to the question of the young man over there about the motives and whether there isn't a desire, at least in some artists and some forms of art, to turn a destructive weapon on human life generally. And you talked about blasphemy. I would say that it's not quite. That's not quite the right word, but that there is such a thing as desecration, when you and where you take things that are regarded as sacred and perhaps have been sacred for you too, and you mutilate them and spit on them, etc. I think there is a human instinct to desecrate what we have previously found been in awe of. A lot of the negative art of our time, I think, comes from that spirit, the desire to desecrate. If you have that desire to desecrate, you might nevertheless pretend that you're not desecrating, and that's part of perhaps of where kitsch comes from. It's very significant that the official art of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was all uniformly kitsch. Kitsch was, as it were, relaying this message of gentleness and cuddly goodwill at the same time as people were being shunted off to the death camps. And some people would say, yeah, this is no accident. The falsification of feeling by art is what makes this kind of immorality possible. So there are deep questions behind what you've been saying, which I think do cast light on our predicament today, why it is that that such terrible things are done, and yet art has this this soporific character at the same time.
I wonder if you would feel comfortable over here. Sorry, if you would feel comfortable extending an analogy to political culture, or if you would prefer not to. And what I was thinking is we're in the middle of yet another interminably long presidential campaign and national campaign, and this idea of fake and fakeness and corruption, a kind of performative art. It's not really doing the work that politics or governing at its most genuine would do, or would you prefer to stay away from that analogy?
Well, obviously it's a sensitive topic. I think the American presidential elections are the best argument in existence for hereditary monarchy. We never have to make this choice, and we never have to go through all this business of faking our distinction. You might say that it takes a lot for a family to be so good that it can go on faking it without having to renew that. But anyway, I think there is an element of, it's not faking, and it's not pretense in the political sphere, but a politician has to appeal to all kinds of interests which he doesn't share. But he has to pretend that he's sharing them. And these might be interests which are extremely destructive, but he's still got to show that he can reward them. And I think this is part of what distorts the language of these great events.
And David, for the last
question. Wasn't it somebody in the Frankfurt School who said that we've got to make culture so putrid that people will choke on it in order to accomplish their aims?
It's the kind of thing they might have said, yeah. But they would have said it also in inverted commas, probably. But that's not the sort of thing that Adorno would have said. He felt that he was rescuing the purity of our cultural inheritance from the disease of popular culture. Whether rightly or wrongly, of course, that just takes us back to the first, whoever it was, who raised that question.
Professor Scruton, in seeing that he just died not too long ago, Robert Hughes, I was wondering if you could comment on his work, and it needs something more specific. I'm thinking of The Shock of the New, and maybe whether you think he got it right about fakes.
Well, Robert Hughes certainly was somebody with whom I feel considerable sympathy. Yeah, and that he felt that not only that people had been taken in, but that this had created a market opportunity, which perpetuated the process of taking in, and that after a while, so much had been invested in it that if anybody did say that the emperor has no clothes, he would be a threat to a whole community. to an economy on which the cities of the Western world depend. So there is he had a lot. There's a lot of sense in what he said.
Well, before we thank Professor Scruton for a terrific lecture, let me just mention that our next event in the Madison program is Monday, November 5th in this room at this time. Marines honor the Supreme Court from Snyder to Alvarez. Those of you interested in the law can look up those two recent Supreme Court decisions. Michael Krauss, professor of law at George Mason, will be with us. The Snyder case had to do with the protests of military funerals. I don't know if you remember when that was in the news. And the Alvarez case has to do with the Supreme Court striking down as a violation of the First Amendment Congress's making illegal one's lying about one's military honors. So Professor Krauss is going to take that on, I believe, in the role of critic, but we'll find out. And then December 6th, a wonderful event with the two, what I believe to be the two leading scholars of Machiavelli's political thought, Harvey Mansfield Jr. From Harvard and our own Maurizio Biroli here at Princeton will engage in a debate about the meaning of Machiavelli's The Prince, which will be celebrating its 500th anniversary of its first circulation next year. And then finally, not on our schedule, but something I hope you'll mark your calendars for, on December 10th, we've just confirmed that Justice Antonin Scalia will be giving a public lecture for the Madison program at 4:30 in the afternoon. Place to be determined. We'll have to figure that one out. It's in Richardson Auditorium. All right, so December 10th for Justice Scalia. So we'll have a reception right outside this room with Mr. Scruton, but please join me in thanking him for a terrific